What if a single moment could bring down a man who ruled for 42 years? What if a protest could turn into a war, and a war into the collapse of an entire nation? Welcome to History Ledger. Tonight we step into the chaos of 2011 when Libya was pulled into a wave of revolution known as the Arab Spring, a time when ordinary people challenged power and paid the price. At the center of it all stood one man, Muammar Gaddafi, a ruler who came to power through revolution and refused to leave without a fight. It began in the streets of Benghazi, where protests sparked hope, but hope was met with bullets. And within days, Libya was no longer protesting, it was fighting. What followed was a brutal civil war, cities under siege, skies filled with warplanes, and the world watching as NATO stepped into the conflict. Tripoli would fall, a dictator would run, and in the ruins of a city called Sirte, the story would reach its violent end. But this is not just the story of how a regime collapsed, it is the story of what came after, because sometimes removing a ruler is only the beginning. For more than 4 decades, Libya stood under the shadow of one man, Muammar Gaddafi. He came to power in 1969 through a military coup, presenting himself as a revolutionary, but over time, his rule hardened into something far more rigid and authoritarian. System where dissent was dangerous and power flowed only from the top. Libya was rich in oil, yet its people lived with limited political freedom. Opposition was silenced, critics disappeared, and beneath the surface, frustration quietly built year after year. Then in early 2011, something changed across the region. A wave of uprisings began to sweep through North Africa and the Middle East, later known as the Arab Spring in Tunisia. A government fell in Egypt, millions took to the streets, and the message was clear: long-standing regimes were no longer untouchable. That message reached Libya. In February 2011, protests erupted in the eastern city of Benghazi. It began with the arrest of a human rights lawyer, an act that ignited public anger. Demonstrations formed quickly, fueled by years of repression and inspired by the revolutions unfolding nearby. At first, the protests were peaceful, but the response was not. Government forces opened fire, live ammunition was used against crowds. What could have remained a political movement began to transform into something far more volatile. Funerals for the dead became rallies for the living. Each crackdown only strengthened the resolve of the protesters. Within days, police stations were attacked. Weapons were seized. Civilians, many with no military training, armed themselves. The uprising had crossed a line in Benghazi. Government authority collapsed. Protesters took control of the city, raising a new flag that symbolized resistance against Gaddafi rule. And for the first time in decades, a different future for Libya seemed possible. But Gaddafi was not a leader who would step aside. He appeared on state television, defiant. He vowed to crush the uprising. He warned that Libya would descend into chaos, and that he would fight until the very end. His forces began mobilizing. Columns of armored vehicles rolled across the country. Fighter jets took to the skies. Cities that had risen against him became targets. The conflict was no longer local, it was spreading rapidly across the nation. What had begun as protests in a single city was now turning into a national rebellion. Libya stood divided. On one side, a regime determined to survive at any cost. On the other, a growing movement of rebels, unorganized, under-equipped, but driven by a powerful idea. That change was finally within reach. The spark had been lit, and there was no turning back. By March 2011, Libya was no longer a country in protest. It was a country at war. What began as scattered uprisings had evolved into a full-scale conflict. On one side stood the forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi, better trained, heavily armed, and organized. On the other, a loose coalition of rebel civilians, defected soldiers, and volunteers, united by a single goal: to end the regime, to bring structure to their movement. Opposition leaders formed the National Transitional Council. It became the political face of the revolution, claiming to represent the will of the Libyan people. But on the battlefield, ideals alone were not enough. Gaddafi forces advanced aggressively. Tanks rolled into contested cities. Artillery pounded rebel positions in places like Misrata. Civilians were trapped under siege, cut off from supplies, surrounded by relentless attacks, and above them the sky became another threat. Warplanes targeted opposition strongholds. The imbalance of power was clear. Without intervention, the rebellion risked being crushed. The world was watching. Reports of civilian casualties spread rapidly. Governments debated their response, and soon the crisis reached the chambers of the United Nations Security Council. On March 17, 2011, a decision was made Resolution 1973, was passed authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. It called for a no-fly zone over Libya, aiming to prevent Gaddafi Air Force from continuing its attack stays. Later, warplanes from NATO entered the conflict. Missile-struck Libyan air defenses fighter jets patrolled the skies, and the balance of power began to shift for the rebels. It was a turning point, with NATO targeting government positions from above opposition forces, pushed forward on the ground. Cities once under siege began to resist more effectively, supply lines opened and momentum slowly changed direction, but the war was far from over. Street by street, block by block, battles raged across Libya and Misrata. Fighters defended their city. With extraordinary resilience in the West, rebel forces advanced toward the capital. Then came August 2011. After months of fighting, opposition forces launched a decisive push toward Tripoli, the heart of Gaddafi power. The battle for the capital was intense, but swift government offenses crumbled faster than expected. Rebel fighters entered the city, taking key positions. Celebrations erupted as symbols of the regime were torn down. Tripoli had fallen for many. It marked the end of an era. Gaddafi's grip on Libya had been broken, but the man himself was still missing, and the war was not yet finished. With the fall of Tripoli, the world believed the war in Libya was nearing its end, but one final chapter remained. Muammar Gaddafi had disappeared for weeks. His whereabouts were unknown. Rumors spread. Some claimed he had fled the country. Others believed he was hiding among loyalist strongholds. In reality, he had retreated to his hometown. Sirte became the last bastion of resistance. Loyalist forces regrouped. They're preparing for a final stand. Rebel fighters advanced steadily, surrounding the city. What followed was a brutal siege, weeks of intense combat, with heavy casualties on both sides. Buildings were reduced to rubble, streets turned into battlegrounds, and civilians once again found themselves trapped in the crossfire. By October 2011, Sirte was collapsing. Rebel forces closed in on the remaining pockets of resistance. Gaddafi, still defiant, attempted to escape the city in a convoy, but he never made it out. On October 20th, 2011, his convoy was struck, and he was captured by rebel fighters. Shortly after, the man who had ruled Libya for 42 years was beaten and killed that same day. The moment was chaotic. Raw and unfiltered images and videos spread across the world within hours. For some it was justice, for others it raised troubling questions about how the war had ended. Soon after, Libya was officially declared liberated. Crowds gathered in celebration, flags waved, and fireworks lit the night sky. A dictatorship had fallen, but beneath the celebration something else was unfolding. The structures of the state had collapsed along with the regime. There was no unified army, no strong central government. Instead, dozens of militias, once united against a common enemy, began to compete for power. Weapons flooded the country. Old rivalries resurfaced, and regional divisions deepened. The revolution had succeeded in removing Gaddafi, but it had not replaced him with stability. In the months and years that followed, Libya would slip into further conflict, fragmented, divided, and struggling to rebuild. The story of 2011 did not end with victory. It ended with a question: what comes after the fall of a dictator? Because in Libya's case, the answer was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The fall of Muammar Gaddafi was supposed to mark a new beginning, but history does not always follow the ending we expect. Libya was declared free, the regime was gone, and the people had won, and yet peace never truly arrived. Instead of unity, divisions deepened. Instead of stability, militias rose, and the revolution that once brought hope left behind a nation still searching for its future. The story of the Libyan Civil War reminds us of something powerful: that the fall of a dictator is not the end of history. Sometimes it is where the hardest chapter begins. If you found this story gripping, there are more untold histories waiting for you. Stories of power and the moments that changed the world forever. Make sure to subscribe to History Ledger if you have not yet, because the next story might change the way you see history. Thanks for watching.